Well now, are you settled? If so, then let's do our little trick. Let your eyes soften, don't close them, just quiet as though the room no longer needs to be watched. And you'll find that the longer you try to stay awake, the sooner sleep will find you. Let your jaw ease open slightly. Let your breathing slow until it finds its own pace. And let the bed support you without you holding yourself up. And if you hear something pause just beyond your line of sight, stay exactly where you are. It's only listening to see if you'll move. Now, let's begin tonight's stories. There are two types of fear that tend to root themselves early in a person's life and never quite loosen their grip. One is the fear of falling, known formally as acrophobia. It does not require height to activate. It can arrive on a low wall, a steep stair, a narrow bridge. It's the body's insistence that the ground should remain close, predictable, and loyal. The other is the fear of horses. Hippophobia. Horses unsettle people, not because they're violent, but because they're vast and decisive. They move when they choose, they panic without warning, they carry weight and momentum that cannot be negotiated with once it begins. Ollie MacDermott lived with both. He had done so quietly and competently for most of his adult life. He avoided cliff paths and elevated crossings. He crossed bridges with his eyes fixed forward and his pace measured. He never mounted a horse, never stood too close to one, never lingered while they were being harnessed or watered. He learned how to arrange his days so that these fears remained background conditions rather than obstacles. That arrangement failed the morning the letter arrived. It wasn't dramatic, no black edges, no threat written plainly. It was simply an instruction delivered in polite, firm language. A business matter beyond the mountains required his presence. Documents needed signing, goods needed authorization. Delay would be taken as refusal, and refusal would dissolve a partnership that supported more than just his own livelihood. The railway didn't reach that far. The lower road added days and passed through stretches where a man travelling alone with papers and coin would draw attention he couldn't afford. That left the high road. The route cut along the mountainside like a blade. It was narrow. It had no guardrail for long stretches. One side pressed into the rock, the other opened directly onto space. Locals spoke of it with the same tone they used for illness. Something acknowledged, endured, and then discussed. No further. Ollie remembered it from childhood. He had been pressed into a carriage seat then, his father's hand resting on his shoulder with steady pressure as if anchoring him to the world. He remembered the sound of hooves close to the edge. He remembered how his body had leaned inward away from the window as if the mountain might tilt and spill them. He hadn't travelled that way since. Now necessity stood where preference once had. The carriage waited in the yard, freshly cleaned, its panels dark and sound. Two horses were already harnessed, tall and broad, their coats shining despite the cold. Steam rose from their nostrils. They stamped once or twice, adjusting their stance, and leather creaked softly. Ollie stopped several paces short and watched. The driver noticed immediately. An older man, weathered but upright, with hands that seemed permanently shaped to reins. His voice was calm, almost casual. "They're steady animals," he said. reading Ollie's hesitation easily. "Done this road plenty of times. They know it better than we do." Ollie nodded. He didn't step closer until the driver had finished checking the straps and stepped aside. The proximity made his chest feel tight. The size of the horses, the heat of them, the sound of their breathing, all of it pressed in on him at once. He kept his movements controlled and brief, climbed into the carriage quickly and shut the door with a careful hand. The sound of it closing felt final. They set off as the light began to thin. At first, the journey was manageable. The road rose gradually. Trees lined both sides, breaking the wind. The carriage rocked gently with the rhythm of hooves. Ollie sat upright, hands folded, counting the rise and fall of motion, reminding himself that he had done harder things than this. The climb lengthened, the trees thinned, the air cooled. When the first gust struck the carriage broadside, it rocked harder than before. Ollie shifted in his seat, bracing his feet. He didn't look out the window. His acrophobia didn't require visual confirmation. It responded to suggestion, to implication, to the knowledge that empty space waited inches beyond wood and glass. Thunder rolled across the mountains. The horses responded with a change in pace. Not a run, just a tightening of movement, a subtle increase that Ollie felt immediately through the floorboards. He leaned forward slightly, listening. The driver clicked his tongue, low and soothing. Rain followed soon after, striking the roof in scattered taps that grew into a steady drumming. Wind found its way between the carriage panels, slipping in through seams. The smell of wet earth rose sharply. A sudden jolt threw Ollie against the side wall. He caught himself, heart pounding. The carriage lurched again, wheels striking uneven stone. Ollie called out, asking if the road ahead was clear. His voice sounded thin to his own ears. The driver answered at once, cheerful enough, said the weather was turning quicker than expected, but there was no danger. The reassurance helped briefly. Another sound came, a scrape beneath the carriage, sharp. It didn't sound like stone or wood. Ollie leaned forward and lifted the curtain at the side window just enough to see. Lightning flashed in the distance, outlining the road in stark contrast. The horses' backs moved steadily. The driver sat in place, reins in hand, posture relaxed. Nothing appeared amiss. The scrape came again, longer this time. The horses tossed their heads. Their pace increased. Ollie let the curtain fall and gripped the edge of the seat. His fear of horses stirred, sharp and immediate. He imagined straps giving way, imagined the animals shying toward the edge, imagined momentum turning the carriage into something unstoppable. Another jolt struck, harder than before. The driver didn't speak. Ollie called out again, louder. No reply came. Rain hammered harder. The wind rose to meet it. The carriage rocked with every gust. Ollie forced himself to lift the curtain again. Lightning flashed. The driver's seat was empty. For a moment, his mind refused to accept it. It attempted to correct the image. The driver must have leaned down. He must have stepped aside. The lightning faded. Darkness returned. Ollie held his breath. Another flash came almost immediately. The seat remained empty. The reins moved. They snapped and tugged in the fleeting wind. The horses surged forward, hooves striking stone with increasing speed. Ollie felt the carriage accelerate. Panic bloomed fully now, fed by both fears at once. the height pressed on him from one side, the power of the horses from the other. He reached for the door latch, then stopped. Opening it meant wind and drop. Staying meant whatever had taken control. A heavy impact struck the underside of the carriage, followed by a sharp crack. One of the horses screamed, a raw animal sound that tore through the storm. Ollie shouted again, though he no longer knew to whom. Lightning split the sky in that bright instant. He saw it. A hunched shape clung along the flank of one of the horses, its limbs bent at angles that didn't align with bone, hair plastered to its head and shoulders. One hand dug into the horse's neck. The animal's skin rippled beneath the grip. The thing's head snapped upward. It wore the driver's hat. His mouth was open in a grin of obvious delight. The light vanished. The carriage surged forward, faster still. Ollie staggered back against the seat, breath ragged. He felt the mountain beneath the wheels, every curve and slope magnified by speed. The carriage tilted toward the open side, then corrected violently. Thunder cracked directly overhead. Another lightning flash tore the dark apart. The creature was gone from the horse's flank. It was on the driver's bench. The hat was pulled low over its brow in mockery. Its posture looked crooked, crouched low, knees drawn too close to its chest. Its hands yanked the reins down and forward with savage enthusiasm. The horses responded with fresh terror, muscles straining, mouths foaming. The thing laughed. The sound was wretched and gleeful, carried by the wind. Ollie slammed his hands against the wall, trying to anchor himself as the carriage bucked. He tasted blood where his teeth met his tongue. He didn't notice when the side window cracked. The next jolt shattered it completely. Glass burst inward. Cold air rushed into the carriage, violent and loud, and with it came the driver's mutilated body. The body slammed halfway through the broken window, pinned awkwardly at the waist. His arms hung limp, his head lolled at an angle that made it clear he would never speak again. Blood streaked his throat, washed thin by rain. The carriage didn't slow. On it went, gaining speed over the thin mountain trail. Next morning, the storm had passed. Mist clung to the lower slopes of the mountains. The high road lay wet and quiet under a pale sky. A carriage rolled into the yard of a house beyond the pass. 2 horses pulled it, exhausted and mud-splattered. Their harnesses hung crooked. Foam crusted their mouths. Steam drifted from their backs in steady clouds. The carriage door swung loosely. There was no driver. There was no passenger. Only shattered glass on the floorboards, dark stains dried by the wind, and the smell of wet leather, and fear lingering in the empty space where a man should have been. No one spoke. The horses were led away in silence. In the great house, the fire was lit, even though the night was mild. It threw a steady orange glow across the rugs and the polished wood, and it gave the room that soft warmth that makes a man feel he could sleep sitting upright if he wanted. Garroge Duffy sat in a leather armchair by the hearth, hands resting on his arms, his shoulders easy, his face still. He looked not at the flames, but past them into the middle distance, as if there was something there he could almost see. From elsewhere in the house came laughter, glasses clinked, a burst of music rose and fell. Footsteps crossed a corridor and faded again. Someone shouted a greeting, and another voice answered with a cheer. It was the sound of a house full of people who felt at home. Garroge didn't move, he didn't smile, he just sat there in the glow, listening without listening, the way an older man sits when his mind is busy with something that has nothing to do with the room he's in. A log shifted in the grate with a small crack and sparks lifted. Garroge blinked slowly, then the sound of the party swelled again and the fire went on burning. Years before that, before the great rooms and the expensive carpets and the noise of people who never seemed to leave, Garroge Duffy lived on 3 acres of land and thought he was missing the whole world. It was a small holding set deep in the countryside, tucked between low hills and a stretch of bog that shone black after rain. A narrow lane wound toward it and ended at a simple gate that needed a shove to close properly. The cottage itself was warm enough when the weather behaved, whitewashed walls, a low roof, a hearth that drew well when you took the time to mind it. Behind it, a patch of veg he kept tidy out of habit. A few fruit trees that had been there longer than him, their branches bent with age and the memory of summers. A small lake not far off, half hidden by reeds, where the water sat still and clear on calm days. It was quiet there. Not dead quiet, but the kind of quiet that has life inside it. Birds, wind, the odd distant cow lowing from a neighboring field, but no voices, no footsteps in the house except your own, and no one calling your name unless you call it yourself first. Garroge had a dog, a plain brown thing with kind eyes, and a cat that came and went as it pleased. He talked to them sometimes, not because he thought they understood, but because the sound of a voice in a lonely place could feel like proof that you were still a person. He wasn't poor in the way people picture poverty. He ate, he worked, he had his health for the most part, he had a roof, he had land, even if it was only 3 acres, but there was a hollowness in him. It wasn't hunger, it was comparison. He would go into town now and again for supplies, and he'd see men with clean coats and polished boots. He'd see women with bright shawls laughing as they walked in groups. He would see lads his age slapping each other on the back outside the pub, loud and alive, and he'd feel himself standing outside the circle, as if the warmth of it couldn't quite reach him. And sometimes he'd catch himself watching a man count coins into a shopkeeper's palm, and a thought would rise in him as natural as breathing. If I had more, I'd be more. He didn't like the thought, no, it embarrassed him, but it returned again and again, and at night, when the dog was curled by the hearth and the cat sat on the sill watching darkness, Garroge would sit with his mug of tea and listen to the silence. The silence could be kind, but it could also be sharp. It could make a man feel his own loneliness like a weight. He began to imagine what it would be like to have a different life, a big house, a warm house with rooms you didn't need, a pocket full of money that you didn't have to count twice. People calling to you, not out of duty, not because they needed something, but because they wanted to sit near you, to laugh with you, to know you. He told himself it was foolish, and still the wanting grew. One evening, as the last light fell behind the hills and the shadows stretched long across the grass, Garroge took a walk to the far edge of his holding. There was a patch there where the grass grew slightly different and the ground rose in a gentle ring. He had known it was there his whole life. Everyone in the parish knew. He didn't build on it. You didn't plough it. You didn't let cattle trample in it if you could help it. A fairy ring. Most men treated such things like they treated storms, something you didn't argue with, even if you didn't fully believe it. You kept your respect, just in case. It cost you nothing to mind your manners. Garroge stood at the edge of the ring and looked down at it. The grass inside was unnaturally neat, almost combed. The air felt cooler above it, as if it held a pocket of its own weather. He should have turned away then. He knew that. He felt it, but the loneliness had teeth that night. He stepped closer. He didn't step into it, not at first. He stood with his boots just outside the curve and looked at the ground like a man in church looking at an altar. He cleared his throat foolishly, as if something might be listening and would require polite speech, and then he spoke quietly, like a prayer. "I'm not asking for harm," he said. "I'm not asking for anyone's bad luck. I only want a bit more, a bit of money, a bit of ease, a bit of company, that's all." The wind moved through the trees behind him. A bird called once and fell silent. Garroge swallowed, suddenly aware of how ridiculous he might look, a grown man whispering to a patch of grass. He forced himself on. "I'm tired of just being nothing," he said. "I'm tired of watching life happen around me and never to me. If there's a way you could grant me a life with money and friends and comfort, I'd be grateful. I'd mind the old ways, and I'd respect what should be respected." He hesitated, then, because wanting can make a man bold, he stepped one boot onto the inner grass, just a toe, barely a trespass, and he said, almost under his breath, the part of it he'd been ashamed to admit even to the air, "I want it all." A cold shiver went over the back of his neck. He pulled his foot back as if the grass had burned him. He stood there for a moment, breathing, then turned and walked home quickly, annoyed with himself, half laughing at his own foolishness. That night, he slept hard. No dreams, no restlessness, just a heavy, deep sleep, as if his body had been waiting for it. And when he woke, the first thing he noticed was the light. It poured in through the small window in a bright, clean way that made the cottage look newer than it had any right to. The air smelled of turf and fresh bread. Fresh bread? Garroge sat up sharply. On the small table near the fireplace, a loaf sat wrapped in cloth. Beside it was a pat of butter, pale and rich, and next to that, as if laid there by a careful hand, was a small pile of coins. Not a few coins he kept in a tin for necessities. No, this was a pile. His heart gave a slow thud. He swung his legs out of bed and crossed the floor quickly, almost afraid the coins might vanish if he blinked. They didn't. He touched them. Cold, heavy, real. He counted them once, then again, his fingers trembling. He looked around the cottage, bewildered, as if expecting to find someone hidden behind the door. No one. The dog lifted its head and wagged its tail lazily, as if this was the most ordinary thing in the world. Garroge went outside. The day was calm, the air soft. The lake in the distance lay still as a place, and yet the place looked changed. The fruit trees seemed fuller. The veg patch seemed greener. The cottage itself seemed warmer, as if the very stones had been pleased. It wasn't a sudden transformation like a theatre trick. It was subtler than that. It was as if the holding had always been capable of beauty, and now beauty had decided to show itself. Garroge stood by his gate and laughed a low sound of disbelief, and then he stopped laughing because he realized something else. He didn't feel lonely. Not in that sharp way he'd felt it the night before. He felt accompanied, not by people, not yet, but by the sense that the world had shifted slightly in his favor. He went into town that day with a handful of coins in his pocket, and he walked like a man who had a reason to take up space. He bought supplies without counting them first. He bought meat without flinching at the price. He spoke to the shopkeeper and found his voice came easier. He even smiled at a woman passing and saw her smile back, and the small thing warmed him more than it should have. That evening he returned home and ate well. As twilight fell, he sat near the fireplace, dog at his feet, cat on the sill, and he felt a quiet satisfaction settle into him. And then, as the light began to fail, the dog lifted its head. It didn't bark or growl, it simply stared toward the gate, ears up. Garroge followed its gaze. A fox stood there, black as coal, and yet not entirely black. Along its flanks, subtle streaks of green glinted when it shifted. Not bright or glowing, just a strange deep green that caught the last light like a wet leaf. Flecks of it ran through the black fur as if someone had dragged a finger dipped in moss across its coat. The fox looked straight at Garroge, not like an animal, like a messenger. Garroge stood slowly. The fox didn't move. It held his gaze for a long moment, then turned its head and took a few steps away from the gate, stopping as if to check whether he followed. Garroge felt a cold awareness slide into his belly. He didn't know how he knew, but he knew. The fox wanted him to come. The dog whined softly and stood too, uncertain, but the fox's stare made the dog step back, tail low. The cat vanished from the sill like a shadow. Garroge's heart beat faster, but curiosity and greed were stronger than fear. He took his coat from the peg, pulled it on, and stepped out into the twilight. The fox walked ahead, always a few paces in front, and Garroge followed. They moved off his land and into the country, leaving the lane and taking a faint path that Garroge wouldn't have noticed on any other day. The fox led him over soft ground and through gorse. It guided him around the edge of the bog, over stones that seemed placed for feet, as if the land itself knew the route. The sky darkened. Mist began to gather, low and quiet, creeping along hollows in the earth. Garroge's breath puffed pale in the cold air. He kept his eyes fixed on the fox's moving shape, afraid that if he lost sight of it, he'd be lost himself. They passed into a sparse woodland where the trees stood thin and tall and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. The fox's green flecks glinted now and again as it moved, like something alive under the skin of the night. Garroge's thoughts turned over and over. This is the answer. This is the price. This is the gift. He didn't know which. At last, the fox led him to a place where the land dipped, a shallow depression that looked like nothing from above, just a sag in the earth. But when the fox stepped down, the world changed. It was as if the depression held its own small country, a hidden hollow where trees grew thicker, where the air was warmer, where the mist hung in delicate strands like smoke that couldn't rise. Garroge felt goosebumps on his skin. Every instinct told him he had stepped somewhere he shouldn't be. The fox stopped at a patch of ground near the base of a twisted old tree and began to sniff, circling, pawing gently at the soil. Garroge stepped closer. He knelt, brushing away leaves and loose earth with his hands. At first, he thought it was stone. Then his fingers struck something that didn't feel like stone at all. Hard, smooth, He cleared more soil, and there it was. Gold. Not coins, not jewelry. A single lump of gold, so massive his mind refused it for a moment. It was the size of a sack of potatoes, a crude, impossible thing that looked like it had been poured from the heart of the earth and cooled there. Carriage's mouth fell open. He touched it. His hands shook. The fox watched him quietly, head tilted slightly. Carriage blessed himself and whispered, "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph." The fox didn't react, as if it had heard worse things than that. Carriage stood, dizzy with it. He wanted to lift it immediately. He wanted to drag it home. He wanted to tell someone. And at the same time, the last thing he wanted was anyone else knowing it existed. He looked around the hollow, half expecting eyes in the trees. There was nothing, only the mist and quiet and the fox's steady gaze. Carriage covered the gold again, heart racing. He pressed earth over it, leaves over the earth, smoothing it out like a man hiding a sin. And then he backed away. The fox turned and began to walk out of the hollow. Carriage followed, glancing back once, as if the mound might vanish the moment he stopped looking at it. By the time he reached home, it was full dark. He bolted his door and sat by the fireplace with his hands pressed to his face, breathing hard. That night he slept in bursts, waking again and again to listen for footsteps that weren't there. The next evening he brought his horse and cart. He returned to the hollow at twilight, following the memory of the route with a precision that surprised him. It was as if the path had stamped itself into his mind. He found the spot. He dug with trembling hands. He uncovered the gold again. It took all his strength and the help of leverage and swear words to hoist it onto the cart. The horse snorted and stamped, uneasy. Carriage covered the lump with sackcloth and turf, hiding it as best he could, and drove home with his heart in his throat. Within a week, he'd found a man in town who dealt in such things, not openly, quietly, behind closed doors. The sort of man who didn't ask too many questions as long as he got his portion. Carriage was offered a sum that made him light-headed. He took it, and once money changes hands in a small place, it moves faster than any horse. Word spread. Carriage Duffy had come into luck, people said. Carriage Duffy was doing well, people said. Carriage Duffy had money, people said, and the saying of it was like a bell ringing. People began to appear. At first it was small, a man calling by just to see how you are, a cousin he hadn't seen in years turning up with a grin and a story, a neighbour bringing a bottle and staying longer than expected. Carriage enjoyed it. He did, and he won't deny that. He laughed more in those first few months than he had in years. He found himself sitting with men in the pubs, buying rounds, telling stories. He felt the warmth of attention like sunlight on skin that had been cold too long. He bought better clothes, better food. He hired men to improve the land. He built onto the cottage, then bought a larger house, and a larger one still, until he found himself standing in rooms he couldn't fill on his own. The invitations began, dinners, parties, functions in the houses of people who had once walked past him without seeing him. He went, and he liked it. For a while. But the more the years passed, the less the faces changed. There was always someone at the door, always someone with a need, always someone with a story about how they'd always liked Carriage, always thought he was a fine man, always someone reaching for him in conversation, in laughter, in expectation. People sat too close, people spoke too loud, and people stayed too late. The great house filled with noise the way a bucket fills with water, slowly at first, then all at once, until it threatened to spill. Garrosh couldn't find quiet anymore. Even when he shut himself into a room, he could hear it through the walls, laughter, music, talk, the constant scrape of chairs and steps and clink of glasses. He could never be fully alone, and he began, in small, private moments, to miss the silence he used to curse. He missed the sound of the wind in his fruit trees. He missed the dog's paws on the cottage floor. He missed eating a simple meal without anyone watching what he ate, without anyone expecting him to perform gratitude or charm. He missed being able to sit and let his mind be empty. At first he told himself it was only tiredness, and then he realized it was something deeper. The things he had asked for, money, popularity, company, had come like a flood. They had filled every corner of his life. There was no dry ground left. He had not understood that peace is a kind of wealth too, and peace, once spent, is hard to earn back. In the great house, the fire was lit, even though the night was wild. Garrosh Duffy sat in the leather armchair, hands resting on his arms, his face still. The party in the next room swelled and fell like a sea. Laughter, music, voices rising together in careless joy. He didn't look sad. He didn't look happy either. He simply looked occupied, as if his mind had wandered somewhere far away, somewhere quiet. And in that place he could see his 3 acres again. He could see the fruit trees bent with age and heavy with apples. He could smell turf smoke from his own small hearth. He could hear the soft lap of the nearby lake and the wind sliding through reeds. He could picture his dog sleeping by the fire and his cat on the sill, and the feeling of a night when nothing demanded of him. True happiness, he realized then, not as a lesson, not as a sermon, but as a simple fact, had never been in the gold, or the manor, or the crowd. It had been in the peace he had once lived inside without recognizing it. Outside the study, a cheer went up. Someone knocked a glass. The noise rose again. Garrosh blinked, slow, and in the glow of the fire, with the great house full of people and the world calling his name, he found himself longing, not for more, but for less, for 3 quiet acres and a life no one else could hear. Night work on the docks stripped people down. It showed what they were when the sun was gone and the only witnesses were water and steel. Men who laughed loudly during the day grew quieter after dark. Others grew sharper. The air carried sound differently at night. Every word landed heavier. Lorcan Cassidy worked the late shift because it paid more and because there were fewer questions asked when you kept your head down. He lifted, hauled, tied, untied. He followed instructions. He arrived early and left when told, and he never argued. He was the sort of man who thanked people for insults, not because he enjoyed them, mind you, but because he didn't know what else to do. The men noticed this. They always did. It started small, the way it always did, a comment here, a laugh there, a nudge that went a little too hard. They learned quickly that Lorcan didn't bite back. He didn't swear, he didn't square up, he didn't even glare. He just endured. They learned other things too. They learned he lived alone with his father. They learned his father was ill. They learned Lorcan had turned down nights out, drinks, cards, women, because I have to go home. They learned which words made him flinch and which made him look at the floor. And once they learned that, they never stopped using them. The night had started like any other. Wind off the water, chains clanking, the smell of diesel and salt. Lorcan worked his section without complaint, his back aching in the familiar way, his hands raw and steady, the left of which had a fresh bandage wrapped around it. They were told to wait inside one of the older storage buildings while instructions were sorted out. The wind had picked up. The building sat right on the edge of the dock, squat and heavy, its walls darkened by decades of salt and oil. Crates were stacked along one side, pallets piled higher near the entrance, left there from an earlier shift. As the last of them stepped inside, a gust rolled in from the quay. Something outside struck the pallet stack hard enough to send it tipping. Wood crashed against wood. The pile collapsed outward, slamming against the steel door. The sound echoed inside the building. Someone swore, someone laughed it off. When they tried the handle a moment later, it barely moved. They leaned into it, pushed harder. The door shifted an inch, maybe, and stopped dead, held fast by the weight outside. "Give it a minute," one of them said. "They'll clear it." So they stayed where they were. No one panicked, not yet. They leaned against the crates. Someone sat down, someone laughed, and then, like it always did, attention drifted to Lorcan. He sat on a crate near the far wall, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes down. He'd hoped stupidly that being stuck might make them forget him. It never did. "Well, would you look at him," a voice said, "sitting there like a good little lad." Another laughed. "Always looks like he's waiting to be told off." Lorcan smiled, quick and automatic. He said nothing. "Does he ever talk?" someone asked. "Or does he just nod his way through life?" "He talks to his da, all right," another voice said. "That's about it. Talking to a dying man all day, that'll rub off on you." That got a louder laugh. Lorcan's smile faded. He turned his face slightly toward the wall. "Careful now," someone said. "He might start crying." He won't," another replied. "Doesn't have it in him." They moved closer. The circle tightened without anyone saying it had. "I heard," one of them said, "that when his da finally goes, Lorcan'll just lie down beside him and wait his turn." "Sure, who'd miss him?" "Doc wouldn't even notice." "World wouldn't notice." Lorcan stood up. Slowly, carefully, like a man afraid of drawing attention, he faced the wall, both hands braced against it. His shoulders rose and fell. Behind him, the voices sharpened. Now, don't go sulking. Don't tell me we've hurt your feelings." "Imagine that," someone said, voice cruel and pleased. "A grown man with feelings." They laughed again, louder, closer. One of them leaned in. "Do you know what I'd do if I were you, Lorcan?" Lorcan didn't turn. "I'd stop pretending this is a life." Another voice joined in. "He can't, sure. This is as good as it gets for him." "And that poor bastard at home," someone added. "Dragging the whole thing out, can't even die properly." That one landed. Lorcan's fingers dug into the wood. "You're the reason he's still breathing, you know that," a voice said. "He'd have the decency to go if he didn't know you'd be lost without him." Christ, someone laughed. Imagine being kept alive out of pity. The light above flickered. Outside, the wind shifted. Lorcan's breathing changed. The sounds behind him blurred into a single distant noise. His hands pressed harder into the wall. The wood creaked under the pressure. His back tightened. Muscles pulled in ways they hadn't before. His shoulders broadened just slightly, as if something beneath his skin was rearranging itself. Someone noticed. What's wrong with him? Lorcan's head lowered. His spine curved. A sound left his throat, not a cry or a shout, something deeper. Fabric tore along his sleeves, not all at once, a slow, ugly sound. Hair pushed through, dark, coarse. The laughter faltered. Lorcan, someone said, uncertain now. He turned. The thing facing them was no longer shaped properly for a man. His face had lengthened, his jaw sat heavier, pulled forward. Teeth showed even when his mouth closed, thick and pale, too many of them pressed together, sharp. His eyes caught the light. They didn't roll, they didn't widen, they fixed. His arms hung lower than they should have. The hands at the ends of them no longer looked like hands. Fingers thickened, nails darkened, curved. His chest pushed forward, his back arched, just enough to change his balance. He took a step. It was careful, measured, placed. No charge, no rush, just certainty. Someone swore. Someone stumbled backward into a crate. What's going on? Lorcan took another step. The space between them shrank, and then the sounds began. Metal struck concrete, wood split, a crate toppled. Something hit the wall hard enough to rattle the light. The dock carried the noise outward. Growls, shouts cut short, the building filled with chaos. No one outside intervened. By the time the door was cleared the following morning, the building stood open and silent. Blood marked the floor, the walls, the crates. Deep gouges scored the wood. The air smelt putrid. Arms, legs, torsos, scattered around in a bloody mess. Lorcan Cassidy was nowhere to be seen. The Gardaí asked questions. They took statements. They wrote reports that didn't add up. A dock accident. They said a fight. Something wild. No one mentioned wolves. The night before, Lorcan had gone for a walk. He hadn't planned to go far, just air, just space. The house felt smaller every day with his father's breathing filling it. He followed the edge of the fields until he heard the sound, a low, pained noise. Not a dog, not quite. He found it near the farmer's fence, dark fur matted with blood, one leg twisted. A bullet had torn through the muscle. The animal watched him, eyes loud with fear and warning. Lorcan, being Lorcan, approached softly. He spoke softly. He reached out. It snapped. Pain flared in his left hand, sharp, immediate. The animal tore free and vanished into the dark. Lorcan wrapped his hand and went home. Later, people said that was when the Phalid chose him. They said the spirit watched the land, guarded the weak, punished cruelty. They said it could be shared if the one who carried it willed it so. As for Pádraig Cassidy, Lorcan's father, he disappeared a week after Lorcan. Neighbours said they'd seen him standing in the yard the night before, upright, breathing easy, looking out toward the hills. Two shapes were seen not long after, moving together across the fields, not walking, loping, free beneath the moon. Daithí Coleraine lived alone long enough that the silence no longer announced itself. It didn't rush in when the door closed. It didn't press on his ears. It simply stayed where it was, settled into the walls and the corners, content to remain untouched. That suited him. Noise took effort. Silence didn't. The storm came in hard during the night. He heard it first in the way the wind changed its sound along the hill, a deeper note that meant trouble was on the way. By the time the rain arrived, it came sideways, rattling against the windows and driving itself into the stonework. Daithí stayed where he was, sitting by the range with a mug cooling in his hands, listening to the house answer back with small creaks and knocks. He'd seen worse. Everyone had. Come morning, the land looked as though it had been picked up and set down again carelessly. Branches lay scattered across the fields. Fences leaned where they shouldn't. The path down toward the stream had turned to soft mud that held the imprint of the wind in shallow ripples. Daithí pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The air carried that clean, sharp smell that followed a hard storm, the sound that made colors look slightly brighter than usual. He walked the boundary of his land, slowly checking what needed fixing and what could wait. He didn't hurry. There was no one expecting him back, and that was when he heard it. It wasn't exactly a cry, more a sound like something unsure of itself, half-formed and thin, coming from the line of gorse near the far fence. Daithí stopped. He stood there for a long moment, listening. The sound came again, a small rasping noise, uneven and brief. "Go on," he muttered, mostly out of habit. He took a few steps closer. The gorse shifted slightly, then stilled. Daithí sighed, already irritated with himself, and pushed the branches aside with the toe of his boot. Something small lay curled in the hollow beneath, its body matted and dark, clotted with mud and leaves. It was no bigger than a loaf of bread, all limbs and fur, its shape awkward and unfinished, as if it hadn't yet settled on what it was meant to be. It looked up at him. Its big brown eyes were open but unfocused, blinking slowly. Daithí straightened at once. "No, no, no," he said. "Absolutely not." The creature made the sound again, weaker this time. Daithí stood there, hands on his hips, looking down at it. He told himself it was nothing to do with him. The storm had carried plenty of things into places they didn't belong. Nature sorted itself out, always had, according to him. And so he turned away. He made it 3 steps. The sound came again, thinner still. Daithí stopped, closed his eyes, opened them again. "Oh, for the love of—" He caught himself off, shook his head, and turned back. Up close, the thing was worse, in an endearing sort of way, though Daithí would never admit it. Its fur clung to it in uneven patches. One ear lay flat against its head, the other bent the wrong way entirely. It smelled faintly of petrichor and sticks. "You're a hairy little burden," Daithí muttered. He crouched down and prodded it lightly with a twig. It flinched. That settled it. He lifted it with both hands, surprised by how little weight there was to it, and tucked it inside his coat without another word. The creature went still at once, pressed against his chest, making no sound at all. He didn't comment on that, either. He set it down on an old sack by the fire once he was back inside. The creature curled into itself, shivering in short bursts. Dahi fetched a towel, dried it roughly, and set about the practical business of keeping it alive without allowing himself to think too much about why. He tried water first. It lapped at it, clumsily, spilling more than it drank. Food took longer. It turned its head away from bread and cheese, sniffed at porridge with vague interest, then ignored it. Eventually, after some trial and error, it accepted a small dish of warm milk, though it drank it with such intensity that Dahi had to hold the bowl steady. "There now," he said, once it was done. "That's enough for you." The creature looked up at him with those big brown eyes, milk clinging to the fur around its mouth. Dahi looked away. He told himself he'd keep it warm for the day, maybe the night, then see if it could manage on its own. That was sensible. That was all this was. The day passed slowly. The creature slept most of it, waking now and then to shuffle closer to the heat. It made no attempt to wander, no attempt to explore. It simply existed where it was placed. Dahi went about his business around it, fixing what he could outside, coming back in to check on it without admitting that that's what he was doing. By evening, it was stronger. It lifted its head more easily. Its big brown eyes followed him when he moved. "Don't you be getting any ideas now," he told it. "You're not staying." It made a soft sound, something between a grunt and a chirr, then tucked its head back down. That night, Dahi slept badly. He told himself it was the storm still working its way out of his bones. He told himself it had nothing to do with the small, warm weight in the next room. Days passed. The creature improved in ways that were hard to measure but impossible to ignore. It learned where the warmth gathered in the house. It learned the sound of Dahi's boots on the floor. It followed him in short, awkward bursts, stopping often, sitting down heavily when it was tired. It ate more, slept less. It had a habit of staring at him from a short distance, head cocked slightly, eyes fixed with an intensity that made Dahi uneasy. He never met its gaze for long. He didn't name it. He didn't speak to it unless necessary, but he found himself setting aside scraps that suited it, found himself checking the door was shut properly before bed, found himself stepping more carefully around the house. When it fell over, which happened often, he helped it up without comment. Once, late in the afternoon, it climbed onto his boot and sat there as if it had decided that that's where it belonged. Dahi looked down at it for a long time, then gently shifted his foot away. "Don't," he said. The creature watched him go, then settled back onto the floor. The nights grew quieter. No more sounds came from the gorse. No shapes moved at the edge of the field. Dahi noticed this without knowing why it mattered, and then one day he began to sense movement in the trees. Evening time, mostly, not close, never close, just enough to suggest attention rather than approach. He ignored it. The creature grew attached in ways that didn't ask permission. It waited for him by the door. It followed him from room to room, stopping where he stopped, sitting where he sat. If he stayed still long enough, it leaned against him, light and warm. Dahi tolerated it, that was the word he used. On the fifth night, he found himself reaching out to scratch behind its bent ear while he stared into the fire. His hand stopped halfway there, then continued on without further argument. The creature made a low, contented sound and leaned harder into his leg. Dahi stared at the flames and said nothing. They came at dusk. He noticed the change in the air first, a shift in the way sound carried, the sense that the land had drawn a little closer around the house. The creature reacted before he did. It lifted its head, alert in a way he hadn't seen before, ears up and body tense. It moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back at him. Dahi stood slowly. Outside, something moved along the edge of the field, then something else. Two shapes, stocky and small, their outlines broken by the brush and the low light. They didn't step fully into view. They didn't rush. They waited. Dahi understood at once. He looked down at that little creature. It made the small sound again, softer this time. So, Dahi said, I suppose that's it. He opened the door. The evening air slipped inside, cool and damp. The shapes beyond the fence shifted, drawing slightly closer, then stopping again. Dahi crouched and lifted the creature. It clung to his coat briefly, then went still in his arms. He walked it to the fence and set it down. The creature hesitated, then turned back toward him. Dahi stood with his hands on his sides. Go on now, go on like a good lad, he said. One of the shapes moved, the other followed. They came no closer than the edge of the field. They didn't reach for the creature, they simply waited. The creature took a few steps toward them, stopped again, then continued on. Dahi didn't move until it was gone from sight. He closed the door carefully behind him. That night, the house felt larger. The days that followed stretched on. Dahi found himself listening for sounds that didn't come, looking toward places that stayed empty. He went through his routines more slowly, not because he meant to, but because there was no reason not to. On the third day, he found something by the door, a small pile of roots and berries neatly arranged, clean. He stared at it for a long time. He left it where it was. That night, the wind rose again, but the house stayed steady. The sound of it against the walls felt different this time, less insistent, and Dahi slept. On the fourth morning, he found the path by the stream cleared of debris, the fallen branches stacked to one side. He stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at the work. Well, fair play to ye, he said quietly. That evening, as the light faded, he sensed movement beyond the field again, not approaching, not leaving, simply there. He didn't go to the door, because he knew. Silence returned to the house. It settled back into the walls and the corners, familiar once more. Dahi sat by the range with his mug cooling in his hands, staring into the fire. Outside, the land rested. He wasn't alone, not in the way he had been before. There are old names for the Groggocks, though most people don't bother remembering them anymore. They were said to be small folk, bound to the land rather than houses, helpful when treated fairly, stubborn when crossed. They worked at night, fixed what storms broke, minded paths and fields when no one was watching. They were never showy about it. They didn't like thanks. They didn't like being noticed. People used to say they had big hearts, though no one ever meant it in a gentle way. It meant loyalty. It meant memory. It meant that when kindness was shown, it wasn't forgotten. And on the morning after the storm, Dahi Colleran did what needed doing. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look for credit. He helped a small, helpless thing because it was there and because no one else would. From that day on, even when he couldn't see them, the land around his home stayed, tended. Paths cleared themselves, fences held. Storms did less harm than they should have. Dahi never spoke of it, and no one ever came to ask. But those who knew the old stories would have understood. Dahi was no longer alone. He'd been taken in as one of their own. When you wake in the morning, please like, subscribe, and leave a small comment. Tell me where you're listening from, because those quiet gestures are what keep this place alive, the faint echoes that let the stories continue night after night. Come back every night. Let this be your resting place. Good night.